So many people are eager for international travel to resume, to see those exotic, far-off locales. And if we get vaccinated, National Cabinet says it can happen.
When we reach 80%, we will lift all restrictions on outbound travel for vaccinated Australians.
It's tempting to think that travel will be just like the old days with only minimal disruption. Temperature checks, rapid antigen testing at the airport, just one more layer of inconvenience. The one thing that'll make this possible? A vaccine passport, and the government's looking to roll them out within weeks.
A vaccine passport is essentially a document, usually on your phone, which will actually confirm that you've had a COVID vaccination, which would then confirm to somebody whether you're safe to be able to pass through.
But many have railed against the concept of vaccine passports.
The form of tyranny hidden in these vaccination certificates is just as real a threat to the nation's spiritual resources as the epidemic itself.
Except that was actually said 142 years ago about documentation that would prove that travellers had been vaccinated against smallpox, because the idea of vaccine passports is not new. They were around in the 19th century when those making the pilgrimage to India had to prove they'd been inoculated against the plague. And many countries today do not allow anyone in without proof of yellow fever vaccination.
There's certain vulnerable groups of people who aren't going to be able to get vaccine passports, aren't going to be able to travel to certain destinations. It's going to be difficult for them, but for most travellers who are able to get a vaccine, I don't think it's going to put them off at all. We can see that there's an enormous appetite for travel.
The term vaccine passport sounds pretty straightforward, but the reality, not so much. For instance, the island of Malta only allows visitors over the age of 12 to enter if they can prove they've been double vaxxed. But Malta only recognises vaccines approved by the European Medicines Agency, which includes the AstraZeneca vaccine produced in Australia, but not the AZ produced in India. Confused? Well, that's just the start. At the moment, Australia only recognises 3 vaccines, but the government's in talks with other countries to decide what other COVID vaccines to include in our international travel bubble.
So you're going to see travel agreements between Australia and countries like Singapore, New Zealand. I wouldn't necessarily see us travelling to Bali or Thailand. So I think you're going to see a very unstructured and fragmented return to travel.
But even when Australia establishes agreements with other nations, the complications won't end there. On one trip, we might end up needing one vaccine passport for the airline, a different one for customs, and another one for the cafes, restaurants and tourism destinations within the given country.
So if you're an Australian citizen going to France, you could fly to France, but because you don't have the French domestic COVID app on your system, you wouldn't be able to go into restaurants or events.
And even once we reach that stage, the rules could still change at any moment. In the UK, travellers returning from countries suddenly put on a red list have found themselves having to fork out for an unexpected 10-day stay in hotel quarantine. One thing that could ease the burden on travellers is the introduction of home quarantine, something the PM is pushing states and territories to embrace.
For international travel to work, we need home quarantine done, and I'm very encouraged by what we're seeing in South Australia and the technology trial that's underway there. New South Wales going down the same path. Home quarantine is where we go next.
And that brings us back to the vaccine passport, because while it may be a divisive concept, it's the countries we want to travel to that will decide who comes and who goes, meaning we may not even have a choice. And that's how travel may actually end up being the silver bullet. Back in July, French President Emmanuel Macron announced a new rule requiring proof of vaccination before citizens could travel domestically or even dine in a restaurant. As soon as he made that declaration, vaccination rates soared.
As of this morning, 1.3 million people tried to get a vaccination appointment.
So while opening the world back up to the type of unrestricted travel we once enjoyed may seem like a recipe for spreading the disease, it could actually be the very thing that boosts vaccinations and ends up making us safer.
Gosh, the world is really not going to be the same again, is it?
It's really complicated. I'm just imagining, for me, the nightmare scenario is I'm on my holiday somewhere, I get COVID, I therefore I have to abandon my holiday while I quarantine in that country, then come back and maybe have to quarantine again, and suddenly this holiday that I thought was great turns out to have been a total waste of time. But I guess that's it. They're the options. You just have to navigate that stuff.
It just feels so far away. Like, I can't even imagine interstate travel anytime soon, let alone that. Like, I realise you're saying that's sooner than we think.
Yeah.
It just still feels like a whole nother world away. Like, I wonder if the world changes a bit in the next year and the virus changes, does all that then change as well?
That's a really good question, because Delta's changed everything as well in the way this works,
And that seems so strange for us, because I got mates in Europe just flitting around having the time of their lives.
I know.
Yeah. But you know what, Rach? The thing is, they're actually flitting less than you think. That's especially the UK example. Like, people are coming home and the country they went to wasn't a red zone, and by the time they get back, it is. Yeah. So it's actually a real pain for them. So it looks like flitting on Instagram, I'm sure. But it's
You mean Instagram isn't telling me the truth? Waleed, I will not believe it.
From expert opinions to in-depth analysis and reporting, the Project YouTube brings you the biggest stories from Australia and around the globe. Hit the subscribe button now for news delivered straight to your feed.